I'm Anne Pasternak Slater, and I am the granddaughter of Leonid Pasternak and the niece of his eldest son, Boris Pasternak. And my mother was Boris's youngest sister. Leonid had 4 children: Boris, Alexander. They were close in age, both born between 1890 and 1900. And in the 20th century, Leonid had 2 daughters, Josephine and then my mother, Lydia. Boris was the lucky eldest son who shared some of Leonid's most formative experiences at his own, in Boris's own extreme youth. So he has very precise, well, I should rather say very strong but impressionistic memories of Leonid putting together the illustrations that he was making for Tolstoy's last novel, Resurrection, and sending them to the publishers. He has a vivid description of this in his earlier autobiography. He wrote 2 autobiographies, one called Safe Conduct and the other, the later one, an essay in autobiography. So here is his description of the atmosphere in the family's Moscow flat when they were waiting for the couriers to come and pick up the finally finished images of Leonid's illustrations. Boris and Alexander shared many of these young memories, but Alexander was a couple of years younger than Boris, and he was very much under the influence of his older brother, who had a very strong personality from the word go. However, he does remember them playing another game that mirrored the atmosphere in the Pasternak's flat, which was the game of exhibitions. Both sons would make pictures of their own on sheets of paper that they begged from their father, and then they would pin them up all over the flat, and they would walk around commenting on each other's work and giving it marks. And it really amused me to find that when I had children, my 2 eldest children did exactly the same thing. Not on any model at all, just naturally. So that the 2 sons had a very rich shared childhood, but Boris was the leader, and he was also much more confident than the rather quiet Leonid-like Alexander. So when Tolstoy died in 1910, Leonid took his son Boris with him to the station at Ostapova, where Tolstoy actually found peace, final peace in death. And he has another vivid description of this experience. Leonid had been invited to Ostapova by Tolstoy's widow, Sofia Andreevna, in order to take an image of Tolstoy on his deathbed in this railway station. Most people in Russia will certainly know the story of how Tolstoy's disagreements with his wife intensified to such a pitch that in the end he took refuge in flight and left the house very much like a self-imposed exile on a Lear-like patriarch. And I don't remember how long he managed to survive before he came to rest in this provincial railway station. It's curious that Boris, like his father, saw Tolstoy in death as in life as a vast force of nature, not just a little old man. In the years of his adolescence and early maturity, Boris became quite a difficult young man. He was full of intellectual energy, independence, curiosity. He was very ready to leave home and go his own way, but at the same time it was a very strong domestic group, and Leonid's sketchbooks and the family photograph albums are full of images of Boris, especially on holidays in the country dachas that the Pasternaks used to go to in the years from about 1910 to 1917. And there is a very very nostalgic and touching memory that is explored by Boris's younger brother Alexander about Boris and his games of Red Indians, trekking and tracking through the undergrowth of the forest surrounding one of the dachas that they visited, and the strange sounds that came from the dacha next door, and then the odd person that they met. One of the most memorable holidays, summer holidays, was in a dacha which was in a country estate that had the most ravishing sunsets. There are many sketches of the landscape surrounding this house, and the crimson sunsets are very striking. And it was on this holiday that Leonid watched, with particularly Boris, the local peasant girls who would round up the horses from the village in the evening and ride them home bareback for the night grazing, which was enclosed safely for the animals' protection. And they were dressed in Russian peasant clothes, red kerchiefs, flying skirts, loose hair, the horses without reins, ridden bareback, or with just the reins, no saddles, and it galloping into the sunset. And this became a picture that Leonid was working on for all that summer, and he was doing it as a pastel on a canvas. It was a very, very vulnerable medium to be using, and he worked on it all the summer. And meanwhile, Boris was watching these girls with a certain jealous fascination and wanted to ride with them, and argued that his father should let him do that. And Leonid would say no, and particularly Rosalia, the mother, would say, for God's sake, don't be crazy, you don't know how to ride bareback, you'll fall off the horse, you'll hurt yourself, you'll get killed. And Boris stuck to his guns, and in the end he did ride with them, and he fell. And he tells this story also in his autobiography. And the result was that Leonid abandoned this image. It was going to be a very big canvas, and we have only a few sketches of it. And the unfinished pastel used to hang in the Pasternak's Moscow flat. And when I heard this story from Boris's brother, my uncle Alexander, I said, "So what happened to the picture?" And he said, "Well, it hung in the flat, and in the war and in the revolutions and all through those years, the pastel was just crumbling away, and in the end it was ruined, and we had to just abandon it. So it never survived." And for Leonid, it was a kind of superstitious omen to him that he shouldn't be doing it. They were curiously fatalistic, this family. They believed in fate. The friendship with Scriabin became a very strong new element in the Pasternak's life, particularly because Boris revered him profoundly and decided that he wanted to become a composer. Meanwhile, the family, when they were in Moscow, were going to Scriabin's concerts, and there is a long series of sketches done by Leonid of a particular concert where Scriabin was conducting, which would have been one of those large sort of rather formal images with the chandeliers and the crowds in the galleries listening to this concert. And I don't think that picture was ever painted. And moreover, in the end, Boris decided that he was not going to be able to become a composer because he didn't have perfect pitch. And however much any of his musical acquaintances in the family, had many of them, but who would say to him, "Don't be silly, it's only piano tuners who need to have perfect pitch, not composers," he took this as yet another fatalistic sign that he should put his gifts elsewhere, and he began writing poetry. Life became much harder, of course, in Russia as the years passed. Boris was in his 20s. He was courting an artist, Evgenia, and they married, I don't know when, and had a son, little Evgeny, Zhenya. Boris was writing. He was already a recognized younger generation poet, and Alexander was training as an architect. And in the revolution and the famine and the civil wars of 1917 to 1921, the whole creative life of the family was in abeyance to political events. Leonid had decided that he could no longer work in the School of Art, where there were political disagreements and a new generation of artists who were much more progressive than he, and he didn't sympathize with them. He became a political artistic journalist. He drew images of meetings of the Soviet and its various committees, which gave him very little artistic room for anything interesting. And when in 1921 Lenin set up the new economic policy, and there was a relaxing of new regulations, and a lot of people left Russia for creative freedom elsewhere, including Leonid and his wife Rosalia and their two daughters, who were 21 and 19 years old. Alexander and Boris remained in Russia, and in the early 20s, both of them, for various services to the state, were given the reward of a trip abroad. Alexander spent a year in Berlin with his parents, studying with a German architect, and his wife accompanied him. And Boris also visited, and Leonid drew portraits of them both at that time. For him, though he didn't know it at the time, these were the culminating images of his two sons, whom he was never to see again when they returned to Russia. So it is quite interesting to see the very strongly personalized images that emerged, rather like the portrait of Tolstoy in the lithograph, that there was a sort of an idealized image that drew on some of the sketches that had come before, and certainly the image of Boris was transferred also to a lithograph, which became easily available. Leonid also, with his wife and their daughters, took on the cherishing opportunities that life was now offering them to help their brothers or sons in looking after the breaking up family that Boris had set up with his two Zhenias. So Zhenya the wife and Zhenya the son visited Leonid and Rosalia in Germany several times, and there are some very tender portraits of the grandson Zhenya by Leonid, and there is a certainly quite critical correspondence between Boris and Leonid, where Leonid is trying to help his son steer a sensible path through a very difficult period for him. He had already fallen in love with what was to become his second wife, Zinaida, and she was to bear him another son, Leonid, or Leonia. So after 1924 or so, the relationship between the parents and their sons became an epistolary one in letters. And it is a sort of long drawn out misery, really, to track that relationship, because the difficulties of communication became more and more intense as the political situation in Russia deteriorated. And in the end, Leonid and his family were in Nazi Germany, and Boris and Alexander and their families were in Stalinist Russia, and both were severely under threat, and neither knew of the seriousness of the threats that faced the other. The German situation was more clearly known to the Russians, but the Russian situation was certainly not known properly to those in Germany. And so in the letters you find subterfuges, particularly in Boris's letters, that are intricately difficult to untangle. And in fact there is one passage in one letter which only the son Zhenya managed to decipher and break the code in the 70s, when he told me about what this particular letter meant. And I could quote it and give the translation, as it was the translation. But it is complicated. And as life became harder and the war began, communication in the end dwindled to a series of in extremis telegrams, 6 telegrams spread over 4 years. But they did continue to contact each other, and so this is the sequence with which their shared lives came to an end.